The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Oak Ridge, a suburban enclave that prided itself on its tranquility and order. The wide, tree-lined streets were quiet, the only sounds the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant hum of lawnmowers. It was a picture of idyllic domesticity, a carefully constructed facade that concealed the subtle undercurrents of tension and prejudice that simmered beneath the surface. 12-year-old Sophia Hayes walked her German shepherd, Max, along the sidewalk, their footsteps a steady rhythm in the fading light. Max, a magnificent creature with a silver-tipped coat and intelligent amber eyes, moved with the quiet confidence of a trained guardian. His presence was a comforting weight beside Sophia, a loyal companion in a world that had become increasingly uncertain. Sophia had grown accustomed to the subtle nuances of Oak Ridge, the way some neighbors offered warm smiles while others averted their gaze, the unspoken understanding that her presence, and that of her father, a black man, was an anomaly in this predominantly white community. She had learned to navigate this social landscape with a maturity beyond her years, a quiet resilience forged in the crucible of loss. 2 years ago, cancer had claimed her mother, Eleanor, leaving a gaping hole in their lives. The vibrant, joyful woman who had filled their home with laughter and warmth was gone, leaving behind an echoing silence and a profound sense of emptiness. Max had been her father's gift in the aftermath, a furry anchor in a sea of grief. Initially trained as a military service dog, Max possessed a rare combination of intelligence, loyalty, and protective instinct. He was more than just a pet. He was Sophia's confidant, her shadow, her furry guardian in a world that had become painfully unpredictable. Her father, Commander Michael Hayes, was a figure of quiet strength and formidable presence. A decorated Delta Force operative, he had served in the shadows, his missions classified, his achievements known only to a select few. His imposing physique and steely gaze spoke of a man who had witnessed the worst of humanity and emerged unbroken. Yet, beneath the hardened exterior lay a deep well of tenderness, reserved for his daughter. His deployments were a constant ache in Sophia's heart, but she understood the importance of his work, the sacrifices he made to protect their country. He was her hero, her protector, the one constant in her life. Today, as they strolled along their usual route, a police cruiser appeared in their periphery. Sophia's father had instilled in her a keen sense of situational awareness, a habit of observing her surroundings and trusting her instincts. She continued walking, her pace steady, Max's leash loose in her hand. The cruiser slowed, then abruptly pulled over. 2 officers emerged, their demeanor casual yet subtly imposing. The older officer, a man with a weathered face and a stern gaze, his name tag reading Calloway, approached them. "Afternoon," he said, his tone conversational, but laced with an underlying scrutiny. "You live around here?" His eyes assessed Sophia, cataloguing her presence in this affluent neighborhood. "Yes, sir," Sophia replied, her voice soft but clear. "My father and I moved here in June." Calloway exchanged a glance with his partner, Officer Miller, a younger man with a hard edge to his features and a restless energy that seemed to vibrate beneath his skin. "Your father home right now?" "He's away on business," Sophia replied, carefully omitting any details of Michael's deployment. "My aunt is staying with me." Miller stepped closer, his gaze lingering on Max. "That's a big dog for a little girl. You sure you can control him?" "Max is trained, sir," Sophia replied, her fingers tightening slightly on the leash. "He's not going to cause any trouble." "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," Calloway said, his hand resting casually near his holster. "You haven't seen anyone unusual around, have you?" "No, sir," Sophia replied, taking a small step backward. Max mirrored her movement, his presence subtly protective. "What's your name, kid?" Calloway asked, his voice softening slightly, but his eyes still sharp. "Sophia," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Calloway nodded. "Well, Sophia, you be careful now." Keep that dog on a leash, and if you see anything out of the ordinary, you call us, all right?" "Yes, sir," Sophia said, her gaze fixed on the ground. Max whined softly, sensing her unease. The officers returned to their cruiser and drove away, leaving Sophia standing on the sidewalk, the echo of their departure, lingering in the air. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. The encounter felt wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her, that their questions were more than just routine. As she continued her walk, she glanced back several times, but the cruiser was nowhere in sight. Max pressed against her leg, his presence a comforting weight. When they reached home, Sophia hurried inside, locking the door behind them. Her aunt, Evelyn, a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, was waiting in the living room. "Everything all right, sweetie?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "You look a little pale." Sophia recounted the encounter with the police officers, her voice trembling slightly. Evelyn listened intently, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "That's unsettling," she said, her brow furrowed. "I don't like the way they questioned you. It felt invasive." "I know," Sophia whispered, hugging Max tightly. "I felt it too." Evelyn placed a comforting hand on Sophia's shoulder. "Don't worry, darling. I'm sure it was just a routine check, but I'll keep a closer eye out from now on." That night, sleep offered little respite. Sophia tossed and turned, replaying the encounter in her mind. The officers' faces, their questions, the way they looked at Max, it all swirled in a vortex of unease. She finally drifted off into a restless sleep, plagued by fragmented dreams of flashing lights and menacing figures. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, in the heart of a desolate Afghan mountain range, Commander Michael Hayes stood before a holographic display, his eyes scanning the intricate schematics of a fortified enemy compound. The air in the dimly lit command center crackled with tension, the silence punctuated only by the hum of machinery and the hushed voices of his team. Hayes was a legend in the Delta Force, a ghost in the machine. His name was whispered in awe and fear, his exploits shrouded in secrecy. He was a master of infiltration, a relentless warrior, a man forged in the fires of combat. But beneath the hardened exterior lay a fierce devotion to his daughter, a love that burned brighter than any battlefield. His phone vibrated, the screen displaying an unfamiliar number. He hesitated for a moment, then answered. "Hayes," he said, his voice curt and professional. "Michael?" The voice on the other end was Evelyn's, her tone laced with urgency. A knot of apprehension tightened in Hayes's chest. Evelyn rarely called him on his secure line, unless it was an emergency. "Evelyn, what is it? Is Sophia all right?" Evelyn quickly relayed the events of the afternoon, her voice trembling slightly as she described the encounter with the police officers. Hayes listened in silence, his grip tightening on the phone. A cold fury began to simmer beneath his calm facade. "They questioned her?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "They questioned my daughter." "Yes, Michael," Evelyn replied. "They seemed suspicious. I don't know why, but it felt like more than just a routine check." Hayes closed his eyes, his mind racing. He knew the world could be a dangerous place, even in the seemingly safe confines of suburban America. But the thought of anyone threatening Sophia, of anyone causing her harm, ignited a primal rage within him. "I want you to stay close to her, Evelyn," he said, his voice firm. "Don't let her out of your sight. I'll be on the next flight. Home." "Michael, you can't just leave your mission," Evelyn protested. "You know how important this is." "Sophia is more important," Hayes replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I'll find a way to extract. Just keep her safe." He ended the call, his gaze hardening. The mission, the war, the world, none of it mattered in that moment. Only Sophia mattered. And anyone who dared to threaten her would face the full force of his wrath. Back in Oak Ridge, the following day dawned with an unsettling calm. The The sun shone brightly, birds sang merrily, and the neighborhood seemed to hum with its usual rhythm. But beneath the surface, a sense of unease lingered, a premonition of impending darkness. Sophia tried to shake off her anxieties, but the memory of the police officers' faces haunted her. She stayed close to Evelyn, her hand rarely leaving Max's fur. They spent the day indoors, reading, playing games, trying to create a semblance of normalcy. As evening approached, Evelyn suggested they order pizza for dinner. Sophia agreed, eager for any distraction. While they waited for the delivery, they watched a movie. Max curled up at Sophia's feet. The doorbell rang, and Sophia jumped up to answer it. Max followed close behind, his tail wagging expectantly. Sophia opened the door, her smile fading as she took in the sight before her. It wasn't the pizza delivery guy. It was Officer Miller. He stood on the porch, his hand resting on his holster, his expression unreadable. "Evening, Sophia," he said, his voice flat. "We need to ask you a few more questions." Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. "My aunt is here," she said, her voice trembling. "Can't you ask them later?" "It won't take long," Miller replied, his gaze unwavering. "Just a few minutes." Evelyn appeared behind Sophia, her eyes narrowing. "What is it, officer? What more could you possibly need to ask a 12-year-old? Miller's gaze shifted to Evelyn. "We received another report of suspicious activity. We just want to make sure everything is all right." "We're fine," Evelyn said, firmly. "We've already answered your questions. Please leave." Miller's jaw tightened. "I'm afraid I can't do that, ma'am. I need to speak with Sophia." Max stepped forward, his low growl rumbling in his chest. His hackles rose, and his eyes fixed on Miller, his body tense and ready to defend. "Max, heel!" Sophia commanded, her voice firm despite her fear. Max obeyed instantly, settling back on his haunches, his gaze still fixed on Miller. Miller's hand moved closer to his holster. "Control your dog, kid. I don't want any trouble." "He's not going to cause any trouble," Sophia said, her voice shaking. "Please, just leave us alone." "I can't do that," Miller repeated. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on Sophia. Suddenly, the air exploded with a deafening roar. A black SUV screeched to a halt in front of the house, its tires squealing. On the asphalt, the doors flew open, and 3 figures in tactical gear emerged, their faces obscured by masks, their weapons drawn. Miller whirled around, his eyes widening in shock. "What the hell is this?" he shouted. The lead figure, a tall, imposing man with a steely gaze, stepped forward. His voice, though muffled by the mask, carried an unmistakable authority. "Officer Miller," he said, his tone cold and menacing. "You are interfering with an ongoing investigation. Stand down." Miller's hand tightened on his holster. "Who the hell are you? You have no jurisdiction here." The figure chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Jurisdiction is irrelevant. You are a threat to my family, and that is unacceptable." Before Miller could react, the figure moved with lightning speed. He disarmed Miller in a blur of motion, his hand a steel vice around the officer's wrist. Miller cried out in pain as his weapon clattered to the ground. The other 2 figures moved forward, their weapons trained on Miller. He stood frozen, his face pale with fear. The lead figure turned to Sophia and Evelyn, his gaze softening slightly. "Are you two all right?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Sophia stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't recognize him, but there was something familiar about his eyes, something that stirred a deep sense of recognition. We're fine," Evelyn stammered, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" The figure hesitated for a moment, then reached up and slowly removed his mask. Sophia gasped. It was her father. Commander Michael Hayes stood before them, his face grim, but his eyes filled with a fierce protectiveness. He was home. The shock that paralyzed Sophia and Evelyn slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a whirlwind of confusion, relief, and a growing sense of unease. Michael Hayes, The man they knew as a loving father and devoted brother stood before them, transformed into a figure of formidable power and unsettling intensity. The tactical gear, the weapons, the swift and brutal efficiency. It was a glimpse into a world they had only vaguely imagined, a world of shadows and secrets, of danger and violence. "Dad," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. "What's going on?" Hayes knelt before her, his gaze softening as he gently brushed a stray tear from her cheek. "I'm here now, sweetheart," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm going to protect you, I promise." He turned to Evelyn, his expression hardening. "Evelyn, take Sophia inside. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone except me." Evelyn nodded, her face pale but resolute. She gently guided Sophia towards the house, her eyes darting nervously between Hayes and the two figures standing guard. They were like phantoms, their presence silent and menacing, their faces obscured by their masks. Max, sensing the tension, stayed close to Sophia, his low growl a constant warning. Once Sophia and Evelyn were safely inside, Hayes turned his attention back to Officer Miller. The officer was still frozen in shock, his eyes wide with fear. Hayes's two companions, their weapons trained on Miller, remained silent and watchful. They were ghosts, phantoms of a world of shadows and secrets, their presence a stark contrast to the quiet suburban setting. "You have some explaining to do, officer," Hayes said, his voice dangerously low, each word carefully measured. "Why were you harassing my daughter?" Miller swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. I was just doing my job, sir. We received a report of suspicious activity." "Suspicious activity?" Hayes scoffed, a humorless laugh escaping his lips. "A 12-year-old girl walking her dog. Is that what constitutes suspicious activity in Oak Ridge?" "We've had a string of burglaries in the area," Miller stammered, his eyes darting between Hayes and his companions. "We're just being thorough." "Thorough?" Hayes's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Or are you targeting my daughter because she's different? Because she doesn't fit your narrow definition of what belongs in this community?" Miller flinched, his face reddening. "That's not what this is about, sir, I swear." Hayes stepped closer, his imposing figure towering over Miller. "Then tell me, officer, what exactly is this about? What is so important that you need to intimidate a child in her own home?" Before Miller could answer, a voice crackled from Hayes's earpiece. "Commander, we have company." Hayes's head snapped up, his senses immediately sharpening. "How many?" "2. Cruisers approaching from opposite ends of the street," Hayes cursed under his breath. He hadn't expected backup so quickly. He glanced at Miller, then back at his men. "Secure him. We're not going to escalate this." His men moved swiftly, restraining Miller with zip ties. Hayes turned and walked towards the approaching cruisers, his movements fluid and purposeful. He held up his hands, signaling for the cruisers to stop. The first cruiser screeched to a halt, and 2 officers emerged, their weapons drawn. The second cruiser arrived moments later, and 2 more officers joined the standoff. The street was now a scene of tense confrontation, the quiet suburban atmosphere shattered by the presence of armed men and the threat of violence. "Drop your weapons!" one of the officers shouted, his voice trembling slightly. "Police, you are under arrest!" Hayes remained calm, his gaze unwavering. "I am not here to cause any trouble," he said, his voice clear and authoritative. "I am here to protect my family. I want to know why your officers were harassing my daughter." "Harassing?" the officer scoffed. "They were conducting a routine investigation." "Routine?" Hayes's voice hardened. "Intimidating a child is not routine. I want answers, and I want them now." The standoff continued for several tense moments, the air thick with anticipation. The officers seemed unsure of what to do. Hayes's presence exuded an aura of power and danger that they couldn't quite comprehend. It was as if they were facing a force beyond their understanding, a storm they couldn't control. Suddenly, the lead officer's radio crackled to life. "All units, stand down," a voice ordered, the authority in it unmistakable. "Stand down immediately!" The officers exchanged confused glances, but they slowly lowered their weapons. "What's going on?" one of them muttered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," the lead officer replied, his brow furrowed. But that was the captain's voice. Hayes watched them carefully, his senses on high alert. He didn't trust this sudden change of heart. Something was wrong. There was a puppeteer pulling the strings, and he needed to know who it was. As the officers began to back away, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man in a dark suit, his face obscured by the darkness of the surrounding trees. He walked towards Hayes with an air of quiet authority, his movements precise and deliberate. "Commander Hayes," the man said, his voice smooth and controlled, devoid of any emotion. "We need to talk." Hayes's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing. "Who are you? What do you want?" "My name is Agent Sterling," the man replied. "I'm with the FBI. I'm here to ensure that this situation is resolved peacefully." "The FBI?" Hayes scoffed. "What does the FBI have to do with this?" "This situation is more complex than you realize, Commander," Sterling said, his voice firm but laced with a hint of warning. "There are forces at play here that you are not aware of. Forces that are very dangerous." Hayes's grip tightened. "What kind of forces? What are you talking about?" Sterling hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the surrounding area, then sighed. "I can't tell you everything right now, but I can tell you that your daughter is in danger, and so are you." Hayes's heart pounded in his chest. Danger? What kind of danger? He had faced down terrorists, drug lords, and rogue nations. He had stared death in the face countless times. But this felt different. This felt personal, insidious, like an unseen enemy lurking in the shadows. "What do you want me to do?" Hayes asked, his voice low, his tone brooking no argument. "Come with me," Sterling said. "I can explain everything. But we need to talk somewhere safe." Hayes glanced back at his house, his eyes lingering on the closed door. He knew he couldn't leave Sophia and Evelyn unprotected, but he also knew he had to find out what was going on. He had to understand the threat in order to neutralize it. "All right," Hayes said finally. "But my men stay here. They protect my family." Sterling nodded. "Agreed." Hayes turned to his men. "Stay here. Protect Sophia and Evelyn with your lives. I'll be back as soon as I can." His men nodded, their faces grim but resolute. They were soldiers, trained to follow orders, to protect the innocent. They would not fail him. Hayes climbed into Sterling's car, and they sped away into the night, leaving behind the quiet suburban street and the simmering tensions that lay beneath its peaceful facade. The night was just beginning, and the darkness held secrets that would soon unravel. Secrets that would shatter the world as they knew it. The unseen war had begun. The car sped through the darkened streets, leaving behind the quiet facade of Oak Ridge. Hayes sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, his mind racing to process the events of the evening. He trusted no one, and Agent Sterling was no exception. He knew that the world was a complex and dangerous place, filled with hidden agendas and unseen enemies. He had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving, and that the truth was often buried beneath layers of lies and deceit. Sterling, for his part, remained equally silent, his focus solely on navigating the winding roads. The tension in the car was palpable, a heavy weight that pressed down on them both. The city lights blurred into streaks of color outside the window, reflecting the turmoil within Hayes's soul. He was a soldier, trained to fight and protect, but this felt different. This was a battle fought not on a battlefield, but in the shadows, where the enemy was unseen and the rules were constantly shifting. After what seemed like an eternity, Sterling pulled into an underground parking garage, the air thick with the smell of exhaust and damp concrete. The silence was broken only by the hum of the car engine and the distant drip of water. Sterling parked the car and turned to Hayes. his expression unreadable. "We're here," he said, his voice flat. "This is a safe place. We can talk freely." Hayes nodded, his eyes scanning the dimly lit garage. He was wary, his senses on high alert. He knew that danger could lurk in the most unexpected places. Sterling led the way to a nondescript elevator, the doors sliding open with a mechanical hiss. They stepped inside, and the elevator ascended smoothly and silently. Hayes watched the numbers change, his mind calculating the potential risks and escape routes. The elevator doors opened onto a dimly lit corridor. The air was stale and cold, and the silence was unnerving. Sterling walked briskly down the corridor, his footsteps echoing softly on the concrete floor. Hayes followed close behind, his hand instinctively moving to the small of his back where he no longer carried a weapon. They reached a secure door, reinforced with steel and equipped with a keypad and a retinal scanner. Sterling swiped a card and entered a code, then placed his eye against the scanner. The door clicked open, and they stepped inside. The room was small and sterile, dominated by a large metal table and several monitors displaying surveillance footage. Hayes recognized some of the locations: his own street, the police station, a local bar. The room was a labyrinth of secrets, a place where the truth was both hidden and revealed. "What is this place?" Hayes asked, his voice sharp, his eyes scanning the monitors. "A safe house," Sterling replied, his tone clipped and professional. "A place where we can talk without being overheard." "Talk about what?" Hayes pressed, his gaze unwavering. "About why my daughter is in danger? About why the FBI is involved in a local police matter?" Sterling sighed, running a hand through his hair. He seemed weary, as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Commander, this is not just a local police matter," he said, his voice laced with a hint of frustration. "What happened to your daughter and her dog is connected to something much larger, something much more sinister." He gestured to the monitors. "We've been investigating a pattern of suspicious activity in Oak Ridge for several months now. A series of incidents, seemingly unrelated, but all pointing to a disturbing trend." "What kind of incidents?" Hayes asked, his eyes narrowing, his mind already piecing together the fragments of information. "Racial profiling, harassment, intimidation," Sterling replied, his voice grim. "Families of color being targeted, forced out of their homes. And the Oak Ridge Police Department has been turning a blind eye, or worse, actively participating." Hayes's jaw tightened. The anger that had been simmering within him began to boil over. "And you think Calloway and Miller are involved?" "They're key players," Sterling confirmed. "But they're just foot soldiers. There's someone else pulling the strings. Someone with influence. Someone with power." "Who?" Hayes demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "We're still trying to identify him," Sterling said, his voice cautious. "But we know he's organized a group of like-minded individuals, a sort of vigilante organization. They call themselves the Neighborhood Integrity Coalition." Hayes scoffed, a humorless laugh escaping his lips. "Integrity? They terrorize families and shoot innocent animals. What kind of integrity is that?" "It's a twisted kind," Sterling admitted, his voice laced with disgust. "They believe they're protecting their community, preserving its purity. They see diversity as a threat." Hayes's fists clenched. The images of Sophia's face, her eyes filled with terror and grief, flashed through his mind. The rage within him threatened to consume him. "And you think they're responsible for what happened to Sophia?" "It's the most likely explanation," Sterling replied, his voice firm. "Your arrival in Oak Ridge, your family's presence, it disrupted their carefully constructed world. They wanted to send a message." "A message received," Hayes said, his voice low and dangerous, each word laced with a promise of retribution. "But they messed with the wrong family. I know you want justice." "Commander," Sterling said, his eyes pleading, "but you need to understand the situation. These people are dangerous. They have connections, resources. They won't hesitate to use violence. I'm not afraid of violence, Hayes retorted, his voice hardening. I've faced down worse. This isn't a battlefield, Commander, Sterling said, his voice firm but laced with urgency. This is your home, and Sophia is your priority. You can't let your desire for revenge put her in more danger. Hayes fell silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. He knew Sterling was right. He couldn't act rashly. He had to think strategically, to protect Sophia above all else. But the desire for vengeance burned within him, a fire that threatened to consume him. What do you want me to do? Hayes asked finally, his voice barely a whisper. Work with us, Sterling said, his eyes filled with a flicker of hope. Help us dismantle this organization. We can bring them down, but we need your expertise. Your skills. Hayes hesitated. He was a soldier, not a cop. His methods were unconventional. He was used to operating outside the law, to taking matters into his own hands. But he also knew that Sterling was offering him a chance to fight back, to avenge Max, to protect Sophia, and he knew that he couldn't do it alone. All right, Hayes said finally. I'm in, but on my terms. Sterling nodded, a flicker of relief in his eyes. Agreed, but you need to understand the risks. This is going to be dangerous. There's no turning back. I know the risks, Hayes replied, his voice grim. I'm ready. And so an unlikely alliance was forged in the shadows, a partnership between a Delta Force operative and an FBI agent, united by a common goal, to bring justice to those who had wronged them, to protect the innocent, and to expose the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of a seemingly peaceful town. The labyrinth of secrets was about to be explored, and the truth would soon be revealed. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Hayes moved with a quiet intensity, his focus unwavering. He was a man of action, a soldier trained to solve problems with decisive force. But he also understood the importance of intelligence, of gathering information and understanding the enemy before engaging them. He knew that this was not a conventional war, and he would have to adapt his tactics to the shadows. Sterling provided him with resources, access to databases, and the support of a small team of agents. They worked in secret, their operation hidden from the prying eyes of the Oak Ridge Police Department, who were likely compromised. Hayes pored over surveillance footage, analyzed crime scene photos, and pored over documents, piecing together the puzzle of the Neighborhood Integrity Coalition. He was determined to understand their motives, their methods, and their network. He learned that the coalition was more than just a group of vigilantes. It was a well-organized network, with deep roots in the community. Its members included not only police officers like Calloway and Miller, but also local businessmen, politicians, and even religious leaders. They operated with impunity, their actions shielded by a veil of secrecy and a code of silence. They used intimidation, harassment, and violence to enforce their agenda, targeting anyone who threatened their vision of a pure Oak Ridge. Hayes also discovered the identity of the coalition's leader, a wealthy real estate developer named Richard Pearson. Pearson was a pillar of the community, a respected figure with connections to the highest levels of power. He was a man who exuded charm and confidence, but beneath the facade of respectability lay a ruthless ambition and a deep-seated hatred. Pearson saw himself as the guardian of Oak Ridge, the protector of its values and traditions. He believed that diversity was a cancer, eating away at the town's soul, and he was willing to do anything to eradicate it. He used the coalition as his weapon, manipulating them with promises of power and influence, fueling their hatred with his own twisted ideology. As Hayes delved deeper into the investigation, he felt a growing sense of unease. The coalition's reach was far wider than he had initially imagined. Their influence permeated every aspect of Oak Ridge society, like a dark stain spreading through the fabric of the community. He realized that this wasn't just about avenging Max. This was about something much bigger. This was about fighting for the soul of a community, about standing up against hatred and injustice. This was about protecting the innocent and exposing the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of a seemingly peaceful town. And he knew that he couldn't do it alone. He was a warrior, but he was also a father and a brother. He needed his family, their love and support, their strength and courage. He reached out to Jasmine, his sister, the fierce civil rights attorney. He told her everything he had learned, the truth about the coalition, the depth of their corruption. He knew that she would be shocked, but he also knew that she would be ready to fight. Jasmine was indeed shocked, but not surprised. She had seen the signs, the subtle prejudices, the unspoken biases that permeated Oak Ridge. She had felt the chill in the air, the undercurrent of hostility that flowed beneath the surface of polite society. But she had never imagined the extent of the rot. "Michael," she said, her voice trembling with anger. This is unbelievable. We have to do something." "I know," Hayes replied, his voice firm. "And I have a plan, but it's going to be dangerous. I need you to be prepared." "I'm always prepared," Jasmine said, her voice hardening. "I'm not afraid of these people. I've fought battles like this before." "This is different, Jas," Hayes warned. "This is personal. They've already hurt Sophia. They won't hesitate to hurt her again." Jasmine's face softened, her eyes filled with a fierce protectiveness. "I know, Michael, but I'm not going to let them win. I'm going to stand with you. We're going to bring them down, together." And so, the battle lines were drawn. On one side, the Neighborhood Integrity Coalition, a powerful network of corrupt individuals determined to maintain their grip on Oak Ridge. On the other side, an unlikely alliance of justice seekers, a Delta Force operative, an FBI agent, and a civil rights attorney, united by their unwavering commitment to truth and righteousness. The stage was set for a showdown, a confrontation that would determine the fate of a community and the future of a family. The weight of justice rested on their shoulders, and they were ready to bear it. The shadow network would be exposed, and the truth would finally come to light. The investigation continued, and the more Hayes learned, the more determined he became to expose the coalition and bring them to justice. He worked tirelessly, fueled by a righteous anger and a fierce desire to protect his daughter. But he also knew that he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The coalition was powerful and ruthless, and they wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who threatened their agenda. One evening, as Hayes was reviewing surveillance footage, his phone rang. He answered cautiously, his senses immediately on high alert. "Hayes," he answered, his voice neutral, revealing nothing. "Commander Hayes." The male voice on the other end was hesitant, young, and laced with a hint of fear. "This is Officer Thomas. Parker, I was there the day your daughter's dog was shot." Michael's grip tightened on the phone. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of hope and suspicion warring within him. "What do you want?" Officer Parker offered to talk in person. His voice dropped lower, as if he were afraid of being overheard. "What happened to your daughter wasn't right. The report, it's not what actually happened." Hayes remained silent, his mind racing. He knew that this could be a trap, a ploy by the coalition to lure him into the open. But he also knew that it could be a chance to uncover the truth, to find an ally within the enemy's ranks. "I didn't say anything then, and I've been having trouble living with myself." Parker's laugh was bitter, filled with self-loathing. "Why tell me this?" Hayes asked, his voice sharp. "Why not report it through proper channels?" Parker's laugh was even more bitter this time. "I tried. My sergeant told me to remember where my loyalty should lie if I wanted to keep my job." Michael considered the possibilities. A trap, a genuine crisis of conscience, a test. He knew that he had to proceed with caution. 4 p.m., the coffee shop on Marlin Saint, he said finally. "Come alone and in civilian clothes." Parker agreed and ended the call. Michael stared at his phone, his mind already analyzing the information, assessing the potential risks and benefits. He trusted no one, but he desperately needed to know the truth. At the appointed time, Michael entered the coffee shop, his senses on high alert. He scanned the room, noting the exits, the other patrons, the overall atmosphere. He was a predator, always aware of his surroundings, always prepared for danger. Parker sat at a table in the back, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. He looked like a man haunted by his conscience, a man caught between his loyalty to his colleagues and his desire to do the right thing. Michael approached cautiously, his hand instinctively moving to the small of his back, where he no longer carried. No, this is risky, but I had to tell someone the truth. Tell me everything, Michael said, his voice low and urgent, his gaze unwavering. Parker hesitated, then took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. The official report is a lie. Max never lunged at Miller. He was standing between Sophia and the officers protecting her. Michael's jaw tightened. The anger that had been simmering within him flared up, but he forced himself to remain calm. I knew it. Calloway had spotted Sophia and commented, "Another one moving in before pulling over," Parker continued, his voice trembling slightly. Max had never lunged, had never bared his teeth. The dog had simply shifted his weight, positioning himself between Sophia and Miller, a protective stance rather than an aggressive one. Miller has a thing about big dogs, Parker explained. Got bit pretty bad as a rookie. But this wasn't about fear. He wasn't afraid. He was... Parker struggled for the word, his face contorted in disgust. Angry, Michael supplied, his voice flat, that a black child had the audacity to walk a powerful dog in a white neighborhood. Parker nodded miserably. After at the station, I tried to talk to my sergeant. He shut me down, said I needed to learn how things worked. The next day, the report was filed. Clean shoot. Case closed. And you signed off on it, Michael said, his voice dangerously quiet, his eyes piercing. Yeah, Parker couldn't meet Michael's eyes. I did. Michael leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. Why come to me now? Because I saw your daughter. Parker's voice cracked with emotion. I saw the way she looked at Max after Miller shot him. I can't forget that. Michael studied Parker, searching for any sign of deception. He saw only remorse and a desperate desire to atone for his silence. He saw a man struggling with his conscience, a man caught in a web of corruption. Thank you for telling me the truth, officer, Michael said finally, his voice firm but laced with a hint of gratitude. It means more than you know. What are you going to do with this information? Parker asked, his voice filled with apprehension. I'm going to get justice for my daughter, Michael replied, his gaze hardening, his voice filled with a quiet determination. And for Max. He left the coffee shop, his mind racing with a renewed sense of purpose. He now had confirmation of what he had suspected all along. The official narrative was a lie, and the system was rigged against him. He knew he couldn't rely on the law to deliver justice. He would have to take matters into his own hands. The whispers of truth had ignited a fire within him, and he was ready to fight. That evening, Michael sat with Jasmine, sharing Parker's account and the evidence he had gathered. The weight of the information pressed down on them, a heavy burden of truth and injustice. Jasmine listened in silence, her expression growing increasingly grim as she absorbed the details of the conspiracy. This is even worse than I thought, she said finally, her voice trembling with anger. It's not just about two rogue cops. It's about a culture of corruption, a system that protects its own at the expense of justice. We have multiple videos, Michael said evenly, his voice betraying none of the turmoil within him, none that captured the exact moment Miller claims Max lunged. And apparently, the word of 3 police officers outweighs the testimony of an old woman and a traumatized child. And a traumatized child. The frustration in Jasmine's voice was palpable. I'm not giving up on the civil case, but criminal charges are off the table. I see. Michael ended the call, his decision crystallizing in his mind. The legal system had failed, as he'd known it would. The time for observation was over. The time for action had come. That evening, Michael watched from his parked car as Officer Calloway exited O'Malley's pub alone. Miller had left an hour earlier, visibly intoxicated, despite being scheduled for patrol the following morning. Calloway had stayed, nursing a single beer while watching the baseball game on the bar's television. He seemed to be savoring the last moments of normalcy before the storm. Now, he walked with the confident swagger of a man who believed himself untouchable, keys twirling around his finger as he headed for his car parked in the dimly lit lot behind the building. He was a man accustomed to power, a man who believed that the rules didn't apply to him. Michael moved silently, a shadow in the darkness, intercepting Calloway just as he reached for his car door. "Officer Calloway." Calloway turned, startled, but quickly recovering his composure. Recognition dawned in his eyes, a flicker of apprehension briefly crossing his face. "You're the kid's father, Commander Hayes." "That's right," Michael said, his voice low and dangerous, each word laced with a barely contained fury. "And you're the man who murdered my daughter's dog." Calloway's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, but Michael was faster. He disarmed the officer in a swift, fluid motion, his movements honed by years of training and combat. He was a predator, and Calloway was his prey. "I'm not here to hurt you, officer," Michael said, his voice deceptively calm, his eyes burning with intensity. "I just want you to understand the consequences of your actions." Before Calloway could react, Michael struck. A precise, calculated blow to the officer's solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs. It was a move designed to incapacitate, to shock, to instill fear. The officer doubled over, gasping for breath, too shocked to reach for his weapon. Michael grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the car with a force that rattled the metal. "Max was a trained service animal who saved my daughter's life after her mother died," Michael said, his voice still calm despite the violence of his actions. He was not aggressive, he was protective. There's a difference that any competent officer should recognize. Calloway struggled, but Michael had been trained by the best. He pinned the officer against the vehicle with minimal effort, his strength and precision overwhelming. "You have a choice to make, Calloway. You can confess to your crimes, admit that you lied in your report, and apologize to my daughter, or you can face the consequences." Calloway's face was pale with fear, but his eyes still held a spark of defiance, a stubborn refusal to back down. "I'm not confessing to anything," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I did my job." "Then you leave me no choice," Michael said, his voice hardening, his resolve solidifying. He struck again, this time with a precise strike to Calloway's temple. The officer's eyes rolled back in his head, and he slumped against the car, unconscious. It was a move designed to subdue, to neutralize the threat. Michael stood over him for a moment, his chest heaving slightly. He had crossed a line he had sworn never to cross. But he felt no remorse, only a grim satisfaction. He had meted out a measure of justice, a small step towards balancing the scales. He had sent a message, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. The edge of retribution had been reached, and there was no turning back. The following day, Calloway called in sick, claiming a migraine. Michael knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The officers would be back. They wouldn't let this go. They were cornered, and cornered animals were dangerous, and he would be ready. He had anticipated this escalation, prepared for the inevitable confrontation. He was a strategist, a planner, a warrior, who always had a contingency. He continued his surveillance, monitoring the officers' movements, anticipating their next move. He installed additional cameras around his property, turning his home into a fortress, a sanctuary for his family. He wanted to ensure that Sophia and Jasmine were safe, that they would not be collateral damage in this war. He also reached out to an old contact, a former Delta Force comrade named Ben Carter. Carter was a master of infiltration and surveillance, a ghost in the shadows. Michael needed his help, his expertise, his unwavering loyalty. Carter arrived the next day, his face grim when Michael explained the situation. He listened in silence, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and respect. He knew the depths of Michael's capabilities, the lengths he would go to protect his family. "You're walking a dangerous path, Mike," he said, his voice laced with caution. "This isn't a battlefield. You can't operate outside the law." "The law failed my daughter, Ben," Michael replied, his voice firm, his resolve unwavering. "I have to do what's necessary to protect her. I can't stand by and let them get away with this." Carter sighed, a hint of resignation in his eyes. He understood Michael's pain, his anger, his need for justice. He knew that arguing with him would be futile. "I understand, but be careful. You're not the only one playing this game. These guys have connections, resources. They won't hesitate to fight back." He set to work, assisting Michael with his surveillance, analyzing the officers' patterns, and preparing for their inevitable confrontation. He was a professional, efficient, and utterly reliable. He was the perfect ally in this shadow war. The tension in the house was palpable, a heavy weight that pressed down on everyone. Sophia, sensing the undercurrent of danger, clung to Michael, her nightmares worsening. She was haunted by the image of Max's lifeless body, the sound of the gunshot echoing in her mind. Jasmine, torn between her legal obligations and her loyalty to her family, visited frequently, offering what support she could. She was a lawyer, a woman of the law, but she also understood Michael's actions, his need to protect his child. "Michael, please. Be careful," she pleaded one night, her voice trembling with fear. "I don't want to lose you too." "I will, Jazz," Michael assured her, his voice gentle but firm. "But I won't let them hurt Sophia again. I promise you that. I'm going to end this, once and for all." The officers finally made their move 3 days later. They arrived at the house in the late afternoon, their faces grim, their hands resting on their holsters. They had been watching the house, waiting for an opportunity to confront Michael. They were like vultures circling their prey, their patience wearing thin. They were waiting for something or someone. At 4:30 p.m., with the officers still maintaining their surveillance, Michael enacted the next stage of his plan. A call was placed to the precinct from a burner phone reporting a disturbance at a location across town, an address that happened to be in the zone Calloway and Miller were responsible for patrolling. It was a calculated distraction, a move designed to draw them away from the house. Michael watched as the radio call came through, observed Calloway's obvious reluctance to respond, and noted the way Miller gestured angrily toward the Hayes house, before finally putting the cruiser in drive. The moment they were out of sight, Michael moved. He entered his home through the rear entrance, checked that all cameras were operational, and prepared for their return. He was ready for the storm. It wouldn't be long. They would quickly determine the call was false and double back, likely more agitated than before. Sure enough, 43 minutes later, the cruiser screeched to a halt in front of the house. This time, there was no pretense of routine patrol. This time, it was personal. Calloway and Miller approached the front door with the purposeful stride of men intent on confrontation. They were like soldiers marching into battle, their faces set, their weapons ready. Michael positioned himself in the living room, ostensibly reading a book, the picture of Dorian Gray. The cameras hidden throughout the property recorded every angle as Miller banged on the door with unnecessary force. He was eager for a fight, his anger barely contained. Michael opened it with measured calm, his expression unreadable. "Officers, how can I help you?" "Cut the crap, Hayes," Miller snarled, stepping into the house without invitation. He was aggressive, confrontational, and utterly reckless. "We know what you did to Calloway." "He called in sick," Michael replied, mildly, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Perhaps he's feeling under the weather." "Don't play coy with us." Miller's voice was rising, his face flushed with anger. We found him unconscious in the parking lot behind O'Malley's. He has a concussion. That's unfortunate, Michael said, his expression unchanged. But I assure you, I had nothing to do with it. You think we don't know what you're playing at? Miller advanced, his face inches from Michael's. He was trying to intimidate him, to provoke a reaction. Following us, intimidating Officer Calloway. The gathering storm was about to break. You have no proof, Michael replied, his voice calm despite the rising tension. He was in control, a master of his emotions. And I suggest you watch your tone in my home. We don't need proof, Miller snarled, his eyes filled with hatred. He was irrational, driven by anger and a thirst for revenge. We know it was you, and we're not going to let you get away with it. He took another step forward, his hand inching, closer to his weapon. Calloway remained silent, his gaze fixed on Michael, his expression a mixture of anger and apprehension. He was more cautious, more calculating. I suggest you reconsider your approach, officer, Michael said, his voice hardening, his eyes flashing with a warning. You are in my home, threatening me and my family. That is not going to end well for you. Is that a threat? Miller sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. Because I'm not afraid of you, Hayes. You think you're so tough, but you're nothing but a coward. I'm not the one hiding behind a badge, Michael retorted, his voice sharp. And I'm not the one who murdered an innocent animal. Miller's face flushed with rage. He lunged at Michael, his fist flying towards his face. He was impulsive, reckless, and utterly predictable. Michael moved with lightning speed, sidestepping the attack and grabbing Miller's arm. He twisted it sharply, applying pressure to the joint, forcing the officer to his knees. It was a move designed to disable, to subdue, to gain control. Miller cried out in pain, his face contorted in agony. Calloway flinched, his hand moving towards his own weapon. He was hesitant, unsure, caught between his loyalty to his partner and his fear of Michael. Don't even think about it, Michael said, his voice cold and dangerous, his eyes locking onto Calloway's. I don't want to hurt you, officer, but I will if I have to. Calloway hesitated for a moment, then slowly lowered his hand. He could see the intensity in Michael's eyes, the barely contained rage that simmered beneath the surface. He knew that this was not a man to be trifled with. Let him go, Hayes, Calloway said, his voice trembling slightly, his bravado fading. This doesn't have to get out of hand. Michael released Miller's arm, but his gaze remained fixed on the officer. You need to understand something, he said, his voice low and urgent, his words carrying the weight of his conviction. I am not going to let you get away with what you did. I am going to get justice for Max, and I'm going to protect my daughter, no matter what it takes. You can't win, Hayes, Miller said, his voice filled with hatred, his eyes burning with defiance. You're just one man against the system. You don't stand a chance. I'm not afraid of the system, Michael retorted, his voice hardening. And I'm not alone. He gestured towards the shadows in the room. Calloway and Miller's eyes widened as they saw the figure emerge. It was Ben Carter, his face grim, his weapon drawn. He was silent, deadly, and utterly unwavering. You should have left well enough alone, Carter said, his voice cold and menacing, his presence a stark reminder of the danger they faced. Now it's too late. The officers froze, their faces pale with fear. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched. They had underestimated Michael Hayes, and now they were paying the price. The hunter had become the hunted. Get out of my house, Michael said, his voice firm, his authority absolute. And don't come back. If you do, you won't like the consequences. The officers turned and fled, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They were defeated, humiliated, and terrified. Michael watched them go, his chest heaving slightly. He had won this round, but he knew the battle was far from over. This was just the beginning of the siege. The next few days were a tense waiting game. The officers maintained a distant surveillance, their presence a constant reminder of the danger that lurked. Michael and Carter remained vigilant, their senses on high alert, anticipating the enemy's next move. They knew that the coalition wouldn't back down. They were too powerful, too entrenched, too used to getting their way. Jasmine continued to visit, her worry for Michael and Sophia growing with each passing hour. She was caught in a conflict of loyalties, torn between her duty as a lawyer and her love for her family. She wanted to believe in the system, in the power of justice. But she had seen too much corruption, too much injustice, to be truly optimistic. "Michael, this is getting out of hand," she said one evening, her voice trembling slightly. "You can't keep living like this. You can't keep fighting this battle alone." "I'm not alone, Jas," Michael replied, his voice firm. "I have Carter, and I have you, and I have Sophia. That's all I need." "But it's not enough," Jasmine argued, her eyes pleading. "You're risking everything. You're risking your life, your freedom, your future. And for what? For a dog?" "It's not just about a dog, Jas," Michael said, his voice hardening. "It's about justice. It's about protecting the innocent. It's about standing up against evil. And it's about my daughter. I won't let them get away with hurting her." Jasmine sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. She knew that she couldn't reason with Michael when it came to Sophia. His love for his daughter was his driving force, his reason for living, and she knew that she would stand by him no matter what. Meanwhile, Michael and Carter continued their investigation, delving deeper into the labyrinth of the coalition's network. They followed the money trail, tracked the phone calls, and analyzed the surveillance footage. They uncovered a web of corruption that stretched far beyond the Oak Ridge Police Department, reaching into the highest levels of the community. They discovered that Richard Pearson, the wealthy real estate developer, was not just the leader of the coalition. He was also involved in a number of illegal activities, including money laundering, drug trafficking, and extortion. He was a master manipulator, using his wealth and influence to control everyone around him. But the most disturbing discovery was the extent of the coalition's influence within the Oak Ridge Police Department. They had infiltrated the ranks, corrupting officers and turning them into their puppets. They controlled the flow of information, manipulated investigations, and silenced anyone who dared to oppose them. Michael and Carter realized that they were not just fighting a group of vigilantes. They were fighting a powerful and insidious enemy that had taken root within the very system that was supposed to protect them. The enemy was not just outside, the enemy was within. This revelation changed everything. Michael knew that he couldn't trust anyone in the Oak Ridge Police Department. He would have to rely on himself, on Carter, and on Jasmine. They were the only ones he could trust. They were his team, his family, his army. He devised a new plan, a daring and dangerous operation that would strike at the heart of the coalition's power. He knew that it was a gamble, but he was willing to risk everything to bring them down. He was a warrior, a strategist, a man who never gave up. The storm was gathering, the tension was building, and the final confrontation was inevitable. Michael knew that the battle would be fierce and the outcome uncertain, but he was ready. He was prepared to fight for justice, for his family, and for the soul of Oak Ridge. The night of the operation arrived, and the air crackled with anticipation. Michael and Carter prepared for their mission, their movements precise and efficient. They were warriors, honed by years of training, their bodies and minds finely tuned instruments of destruction. They knew the risks, but they were not afraid. They were driven by a higher purpose, a burning desire for justice. Jasmine watched them go, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and pride. She knew that they were walking into the lion's den, facing a powerful and ruthless enemy. But she also knew that they were the only ones who could stop the coalition, who could expose their crimes and bring them to justice. She trusted them, she believed in them, and she prayed for their safety. Michael and Carter slipped into the shadows, their presence unseen, their movements silent and fluid. They navigated the darkened streets, their senses on high alert, their eyes scanning for any sign of danger. They were ghosts, phantoms, masters of infiltration. Their target was Richard Pearson's mansion, a heavily guarded fortress that stood as a symbol of his wealth and power. It was a place of opulence and excess, but also a place of darkness and corruption. It was the heart of the coalition's network, the source of their influence, and the center of their illegal activities. Michael and Carter infiltrated the mansion with ease, their skills and experience allowing them to bypass the security measures. They moved through the maze of corridors and rooms, avoiding security cameras and guards, their footsteps silent on the plush carpets. They were like shadows, unseen and unheard. They reached Pearson's office, a lavishly decorated room that exuded power and control. They could hear voices inside, the sounds of a meeting in progress. Pearson and several other members of the coalition were gathered, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the lamps. The room was filled with tension, the air thick with the stench of corruption and greed. Pearson and his cronies were discussing their plans, their voices filled with arrogance and contempt. They were plotting, scheming, and reveling in their power. Michael and Carter listened in silence, their anger growing with each passing moment. They heard Pearson boast about his influence, his ability to manipulate the system, his control over the police department. They heard him dismiss their victims, their suffering, their lives. They heard him laugh about the death of Max, callously, dismissing it as a necessary sacrifice in his quest for power. He spoke of Sophia with disdain, referring to her as the little brat. That was when Michael decided to make his presence known. He and Carter burst into the room, their weapons drawn, their faces grim, their eyes burning with righteous fury. Pearson and his cronies froze, their faces pale with shock and fear. They were caught off guard, their arrogance shattered, their power stripped away. They were exposed, vulnerable, and facing the consequences of their actions. "The game is over." "Pearson," Michael said, his voice cold and dangerous, each word laced with a promise of retribution. "It's time for you to pay for your crimes." A fierce firefight erupted, the room exploding with gunfire and chaos. Michael and Carter fought with skill and precision, their movements swift and deadly. They were a force of nature, unstoppable and relentless. They took down the guards, one by one, their determination fueled by their desire for justice. They were fighting for Sophia, for Max, for all the victims of the coalition's cruelty. Pearson tried to escape, to flee from the consequences of his actions, but Michael caught him, his grip like a steel vise, his strength overwhelming. "You're not going anywhere," Michael said, his voice filled with hatred, his eyes burning with fury. "You're going to answer for what you've done." He dragged Pearson out of the mansion, his cronies watching in terror. He had brought the fight to the enemy's doorstep, and he had emerged victorious. But the battle was not yet over. The war was still raging. The chaos in the mansion spilled out into the streets, the sounds of gunfire and sirens shattering the tranquility of Oak Ridge. The police, alerted by the commotion, arrived on the scene, their faces a mixture of confusion and hostility. They were caught in the crossfire, unsure of who the enemy was, who the allies were. Michael and Carter emerged from the mansion, Pearson in tow, their weapons drawn, their faces grim. They were surrounded by the police, outnumbered and outgunned, but they were not afraid. They were warriors, trained to fight against all odds. "Stand down," one of the officers shouted, his voice trembling slightly. "Drop your weapons! You are under arrest!" Michael ignored him, his gaze fixed on the crowd of police officers. He knew that some of them were corrupt, loyal to the coalition, but he also knew that some of them were just doing their job, trying to maintain order. He had to be careful to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. "I'm not here to fight you," Michael said, his voice clear and authoritative. I'm here to bring justice to Richard Pearson. He's responsible for the corruption in this town, for the violence against innocent people, for the death of my daughter's dog." His words hung in the air, met with a mixture of disbelief and hostility. The officers were hesitant, unsure of what to do. They had been trained to obey orders, to uphold the law, but they also knew that something was deeply wrong in Oak Ridge. Suddenly, a voice cut through the confusion. "Stand down, everyone! Stand down!" It was Captain Davies, the head of the Oak Ridge Police Department. He pushed his way through the crowd, his face grim, his eyes fixed on Michael. He was a complex figure, a man caught between his loyalty to the system and his own sense of right and wrong. "What the hell is going on here, Hayes?" he demanded, his voice rough. "You can't just go around shooting up Pearson's mansion." "Pearson is a criminal, Davies," Michael replied, his voice firm. "He's the leader of the coalition, the man behind all the corruption in this town. I have evidence to prove it." Davies hesitated, his eyes searching Michael's. He knew that Michael was not a man to be taken lightly. He was a warrior, a force of nature, and he was clearly on a mission. "All right, Hayes," Davies said finally. "I'll hear you out, but you're coming with me, and you're dropping your weapons." Michael nodded, his gaze unwavering. He knew that this was a gamble, but he had no other choice. He had to trust Davies, to believe that he would do the right thing. He and Carter surrendered their weapons, and they were taken into custody. Pearson, still in shock, was also arrested. The crowd of police officers watched in silence, their faces a mixture of confusion and apprehension. Michael and Carter were taken to the police station where they were placed in separate interrogation rooms. Davies entered Michael's room, his face grim. "All right, Hayes," he said, his voice tired. "Start talking. Tell me everything." Michael did, laying out the evidence he and Carter had gathered, exposing the coalition's network and detailing Pearson's crimes. He spoke with passion and conviction, his words painting a vivid picture of corruption and injustice. Davies listened in silence, his expression growing increasingly troubled. He knew that Michael was telling the truth. He had seen the signs, the subtle hints of corruption, but he had chosen to ignore them. Now he could no longer deny the reality. This is unbelievable," Davies said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "I had no idea it was this bad." "It's worse than you can imagine, Davies," Michael replied, his voice firm. "And it's not going to stop until we bring down everyone involved." Davies nodded, his face resolute. "All right, Hayes, I'm with you. We're going to bring them down. All of them." And so, an unlikely alliance was formed, a partnership between a Delta Force operative and a police captain, united by their common goal, to cleanse Oak Ridge of corruption and bring justice to its people. The fall of the king had begun, and the kingdom would soon crumble. The alliance between Michael and Davies was a fragile one, built on necessity and a shared desire for justice. They knew that they were facing a powerful and entrenched enemy, an enemy that would not go down without a fight. They had to be careful, strategic, and ruthless. Davies used his authority to launch an official investigation into the coalition, focusing on Pearson's illegal activities and the corruption within the police department. He assigned a team of trusted officers to assist him, men and women who were loyal to the law and willing to risk their lives to expose the truth. Michael and Carter provided Davies with the evidence they had gathered, acting as his advisors and protectors. They worked in the shadows, their presence a constant threat to the coalition, their actions unpredictable and decisive. The investigation sent shockwaves through Oak Ridge, shattering the illusion of peace and order. The community was divided, torn between those who supported the coalition and those who demanded justice. Fear and suspicion spread like a disease, poisoning the atmosphere. The coalition fought back, using their influence and resources to obstruct the investigation. They spread rumors, intimidated witnesses, and threatened anyone who dared to oppose them. They were desperate, their power waning, their grip on Oak Ridge slipping. Pearson, from his jail cell, orchestrated the counterattack, pulling strings and manipulating his followers. He was a master of deception, a puppet master, and he would not give up without a fight. The tension escalated, the violence intensified, and Oak Ridge descended into chaos. The streets were no longer safe, the nights filled with the sounds of gunfire and sirens. The cleansing fire had been lit, and it threatened to consume everything in its path. Michael and Carter found themselves in the eye of the storm, fighting a war on multiple fronts. They had to protect Davies and his team, expose the coalition's crimes, and bring Pearson to justice. They were warriors, but they were also human, and the weight of the responsibility threatened to crush them. One night, as Davies and his team were raiding a coalition safe house, they were ambushed. The coalition, tipped off by a corrupt officer, had laid a trap. The firefight was brutal, and Davies was critically wounded. Michael and Carter arrived on the scene to find chaos and carnage. Davies lay bleeding on the ground, his life slipping away. His officers fought desperately to hold off the coalition, their faces grim, their determination unwavering. Michael knelt beside Davies, his heart heavy with grief and rage. Davies looked up at him, his eyes filled with pain, but also with a strange sense of peace. "Finish it, Hayes," he whispered, his voice weak. "Bring them down, for Oak Ridge." "I will, Davies," Michael said, his voice firm, his resolve hardening. "I promise you." Davies smiled faintly, then closed his eyes. His last breath escaped his lips, and his body went limp. He was gone, a casualty of the war, a martyr for justice. Michael rose to his feet, his face a mask of fury. The cleansing fire had claimed another victim, and he would not let their sacrifice be in vain. He would avenge Davies, he would destroy the coalition, and he would bring peace to Oak Ridge, no matter the cost. The cleansing fire would burn away the corruption, and from the ashes, a new Oak Ridge would rise. Davies's death ignited a fire in Michael, a burning rage that threatened to consume him. He was a warrior, but he was also a human being, and the loss of his friend pushed him to the edge. He knew that he had to control his emotions, to focus on the mission, but the desire for revenge was a powerful force. Carter, ever the pragmatist, tried to reason with him. "Mike, you can't let this cloud your judgment. We need to stay focused, to stick to the plan." "The plan changed when they killed Davies," Michael retorted, his voice low and dangerous. "Now it's personal." "I know it's personal, but we can't afford to make mistakes," Carter argued, his voice firm. "We need to think strategically, to anticipate their moves." Michael knew that Carter was right, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control. The world was spinning, the lines blurring, and he was struggling to hold on. Meanwhile, Pearson, from his jail cell, was plotting his final move. He had lost control of the streets, but he still had influence within the system. He used his connections to manipulate the investigation, to sow discord among the police officers, and to create chaos in the city. He knew that his time was running out, but he was not going to go down without a fight. He was a cornered animal, and he was dangerous. The tension reached its breaking point, and Oak Ridge erupted into a full-scale war. The streets became battlefields, the police station a fortress under siege, and the lives of innocent civilians hanging in the balance. Michael and Carter found themselves at the center of the conflict, fighting a desperate battle against overwhelming odds. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by enemies. But they were not afraid. They were warriors, and they would fight to the death. They fought with skill and precision, their movements swift and deadly. They were a force of nature, unstoppable and relentless. They took down the corrupt officers, one by one, their determination fueled by their desire for justice. But the coalition was not easily defeated. They were ruthless, cunning, and willing to sacrifice anything to maintain their power. They used every dirty trick in the book, from ambushes to sabotage, to try to eliminate Michael and Carter. The final stand took place at the Oak Ridge Courthouse, where Pearson was scheduled to be arraigned. The coalition, in a desperate attempt to free their leader, launched an all-out assault on the building. The courthouse became a scene of chaos and carnage, the air filled with the sounds of gunfire and explosions. Michael and Carter found themselves trapped inside, surrounded by enemies. They were cornered, but they were not defeated. They fought their way through the building, their determination unwavering. They took down the coalition members, one by one, their skills honed by years of training and combat. Finally, they reached the courtroom, where Pearson was being held. The room was filled with police officers, their faces grim, their weapons drawn. Pearson, seeing Michael and Carter, let out a roar of defiance. "You can't stop me," he shouted. "I am the king of Oak Ridge. I will rule this city forever." Michael stepped forward, his face a mask of fury. "Your reign is over, Pearson," he said, his voice cold and dangerous. "It's time for you to face justice." A final, desperate battle ensued, a clash of titans that would determine the fate of Oak Ridge. Michael and Carter fought with everything they had, their strength and skill unmatched. They took down the remaining coalition members, their determination fueled by the memory of Davies and the desire to protect the innocent. Finally, they stood face to face with Pearson, the man who had caused so much pain and suffering. The man who had murdered Max. Michael's rage reached its peak, and he unleashed his fury upon Pearson. The fight was brutal, relentless, and utterly devastating. In the end, Michael emerged victorious, Pearson defeated and broken. The king had fallen, and his reign of terror was over. But the victory came at a cost. Michael was wounded, his body battered and bruised. He had given everything to win this battle, and he was not sure if he could go on. As he lay on the floor, his vision blurring, he saw Sophia and Jasmine rush into the courtroom. Their faces were filled with fear and relief, their eyes shining with love. They reached him, their arms embracing him, their tears falling on his face. He was home. He was safe. He had won. The aftermath of the final stand was a scene of devastation and exhaustion. The courthouse was in ruins, the streets littered with debris, and the air thick with the smell of smoke and blood. The war had taken its toll, leaving deep scars on the city and its people. Michael lay in a hospital bed, his body battered and bruised, his wounds slowly healing. He was alive, but he was forever changed. The violence he had witnessed, the lives he had taken, the sacrifices he had made, they had all left their mark on his soul. Jasmine and Sophia stayed by his side, their love and presence a constant source of comfort and strength. They nursed him back to health, both physically and emotionally, their unwavering support helping him to find his way back from the darkness. The city of Oak Ridge began the slow process of rebuilding, both literally and figuratively. The coalition's network was dismantled, their corrupt officials brought to justice, and their influence eradicated. The healing process was long and arduous, but the people of Oak Ridge were resilient, and they were determined to create a better future. But the scars of war remained. The violence had exposed the deep-seated divisions within the community, the racial tensions, the social inequalities, and the lingering distrust of authority. It would take time, patience, and a collective effort to bridge the gaps and heal the wounds. Michael, despite his physical recovery, struggled with the emotional and psychological trauma of his experiences. He was haunted by the faces of his enemies, the screams of the dying, and the memories of his own violent actions. He was a warrior, but he was also a man, and the weight of his past threatened to crush him. He found solace in Sophia, her innocence and resilience, a beacon of hope in the darkness. He spent hours talking to her, sharing his stories, and teaching her the lessons he had learned. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the horrors of the world. But he also knew that he had to prepare her for the challenges she would face. He taught her self-defense, survival skills, and the importance of critical thinking. He instilled in her a strong sense of justice, a belief in the power of good, and a determination to stand up for what is right. He also encouraged her to pursue her passions, to find joy and meaning in life. He supported her love of art, her talent for music, and her dreams for the future. He wanted her to be happy, to live a full and fulfilling life, free from the shadows of his past. Jasmine, too, played a crucial role in Michael's healing process. As a lawyer and a civil rights advocate, she understood the complexities of justice, the importance of empathy, and the need for reconciliation. She helped Michael to process his anger, to find forgiveness, and to move forward with hope. She also took on the task of representing the victims of the coalition's crimes, fighting tirelessly to ensure that they received the compensation and support they deserved. She was a champion for the oppressed, a voice for the voiceless, and a force for good in the world. Together, Michael, Sophia, and Jasmine formed a powerful bond, a family united by love, resilience, and a shared commitment to justice. They were survivors, warriors, and beacons of hope in a world that desperately needed their light. The scars of war would always remain, but they would not define them. They would use their experiences to create a better future, to build a community where justice and equality prevailed. They would be the change they wanted to see in the world. Years passed, and Oak Ridge slowly began to heal. The scars of the war faded, replaced by the promise of a brighter future. The city underwent a transformation, a rebirth, guided by the lessons learned from its darkest hour. The community embraced diversity, celebrating its differences and fostering a sense of unity. The prejudices and inequalities that had fueled the coalition's hatred were challenged and dismantled. Oak Ridge became a beacon of tolerance and acceptance, a testament to the power of change. The police department underwent a complete overhaul, its ranks purged of corruption and its practices reformed. A new generation of officers emerged, dedicated to serving and protecting all citizens, regardless of their race, religion, or background. They were guardians of the peace, protectors of the innocent, and champions of justice. Michael, though, forever marked by his experiences, found a measure of peace and purpose in his new life. He dedicated himself to raising Sophia, instilling in her the values of courage, compassion, and resilience. He watched her grow into a strong, intelligent, and compassionate young woman, and his heart swelled with pride. Sophia flourished, her talent for art blossoming into a successful career. Her paintings, vibrant and evocative, captured the beauty and diversity of the world, reflecting her own journey of healing and growth. She became a voice for the voiceless, using her art to advocate for social justice and equality. Jasmine continued, her work as a civil rights attorney, her passion for justice unwavering. She fought tirelessly for the rights of the marginalized, challenging systemic inequalities and empowering communities. She was a force for change, a champion for the oppressed, and a symbol of hope. Together, Michael, Sophia, and Jasmine built a life filled with love, laughter, and purpose. They were a family, bound by their shared experiences, their unwavering support for each other, and their commitment to making the world a better place. One sunny afternoon, Michael and Sophia visited Max's memorial, a beautiful garden in the heart of Oak Ridge. The garden was a symbol of healing and remembrance, a place where people could come to honor the victims of the coalition's violence and to celebrate the city's transformation. Sophia placed a bouquet of flowers at the base of the memorial stone. Her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "I miss him, Dad," she said softly, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "I know, sweetheart," Michael replied, his arm around her shoulder. "But he's always with us, in our hearts. And his memory helped us to create this." They stood in silence for a moment, gazing at the vibrant flowers and the peaceful atmosphere. The garden was a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the enduring spirit of Oak Ridge. As they walked away, hand in hand, Michael looked back at the garden, a sense of peace settling over him. The scars of war would always remain, but they had learned to live with them, to find meaning and purpose in their pain. The sun shone brightly, casting a golden glow over Oak Ridge. It was a new dawn, a new beginning, a testament to the power of hope and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The story of Michael, Sophia, and Jasmine was a story of survival, resilience, and the triumph of good over evil. It was a story that would be told for generations to come, a reminder that, even in the darkest of times, hope can prevail and justice can be achieved. The end.